Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Future Influencers Monthly webinar, and a special welcome to the external speakers who have kindly joined us today. I'm John Wilson, Head of Technical at Spence and Dalriada. I'll be moderator for today, but I've got the easy job in that I've just got to introduce people and look after the Q&As. Other people will be doing the speaking today, and I will get to the speakers and to the agenda shortly, but just a quick bit of housekeeping. With this format, everyone apart from the speakers obviously are muted, but that doesn't mean that you cannot engage with the webinar, and we do hope that you do. There is a Q&A box which hopefully you can see on your screen. I will be keeping an eye on that, and the intention is to do a roundup of all the questions and observations and so on towards the end of the webinar, because we've left plenty of time for that. So we'll pick up on the questions at the end, and because we're doing it in that way, it would help if posting a question, if you could also mention who your question is aimed at as well, so we get the right response from the right person. And speaking of that, that takes me on to today's agenda. And what we have planned for this morning is, first of all, Sarah Ballantyne from Dalriada Trustees looking at the Pensions Regulator Annual Funding Statement, which was published in April. Then we have the wonderfully titled Fishing Expeditions, which actually relates to tips to avoid getting caught by claims management companies' DSARs, Data Subject Access Requests. Really looking forward to this because we have been on the receiving end of, I think, more than our fair share of these fishing expeditions. So Lucy Chapman from Pinsent Masons will be taking us through this issue, probably around 10:20. After that, an update on the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, which it surprised me when I actually thought about it this morning, has now been in force for 2 years. So I'm sure there are some lessons to be learned in that period. And Sarah Miller from ARC Pensions Law is going to take us through that subject. I mentioned that there'll be plenty of times for questions, and there should be. Questions we think will start around 11 AM, and we've left up to 30 minutes for them, with the plan being that we should all be finished in time, well before lunch actually, around 11:30. So on that note then, I will hand over to Sarah Ballantyne to take us through the annual funding statement. Sarah.
Thank you, John. So, yeah, the annual funding statement, as John mentioned, was actually produced by the regulator, or published by the regulator at the end of April, 30th of April of this year. It feels like a long time ago, and you might be asking, well, is it still relevant? Things have moved on quite quickly with all that's been going on this year, and I think the answer is yes, it is still relevant. It's probably more relevant than any annual funding statement that's been published before. And I'll just give a little introduction as to why that is, and also to sort of the tips to look out for in that. So just first a bit of a recap on what the annual funding statement, or AFS, is, less of a tongue twister, and why it's important. So it's, as I say, it's published annually, and it's directed at DB pension schemes with imminent valuation processes. But normally its messages are also relevant because they signal the direction of travel of the regulator's thinking for schemes that aren't in valuation year. It's particularly relevant for the tranche 15, which covers obviously the pandemic period, and it's for schemes with valuation dates starting on the 22nd of September 2019 and running to the 21st of September 2020. But as everybody is well aware, this is not a normal year. And the regulator is guiding that following the guidance is therefore of vital importance, and that's in quotes. And it's also relevant to schemes that are undergoing significant change and that require a review of their funding risks and strategies. So that actually could therefore relate to quite a much bigger group in the new normal than potentially historically. And just finally, just to add on that, for the ones that are in tranche 15, around 50% of the schemes had a valuation date at or near the 31st of March, which I'm sure everybody is well aware was probably a low point in terms of equity markets. So I think the regulator has noted that some schemes will have fared much better than others, depending on their exposures to equity markets and the level of hedging that they had in place. So that's a bit of a scene setter for what we're going to cover on the next few slides. Can I have the next slide, please, Carolyn? So I'm reading the AFS. What I don't think it is a major overhaul. It's the focus is changed, but the key themes remain, and I'm just going to touch on some of these key themes that are present in the current AFS, but also have been present or have been trialled or in previous statements from the regulator. The first one is this longer term funding target or longer term funding objective, which I think it might have made its debut last year as a theme, and is definitely something that is remaining consistent with previous messages. So what is the long-term funding target? It's actually easier to say that than the abbreviation LTFT. So it's paying the promised benefit is the key objective, and that's a key objective for all schemes. So journey planning, it becomes very important, factoring in the scheme maturity and targeting the position to reduce the scheme's dependence on the employer as the journey plan progresses to this target. So that includes de-risking investment strategy, for example, to take away effectively that covenant underpin, to reduce that covenant underpin. And the regulators noting that investment and funding strategy in the interim need to be aligned. So you get your journey plan, you have your long-term target, and along the way you align those strategies to get there. So that's something that was in previous funding statements that remains. Employer sustainability is kind of perhaps the next key theme. There's definitely a greater emphasis on that than there has been in the recent past, but I would say if you look back far enough, and it's actually not that far, there's a definite sort of pendulum swing. Employer sustainability was a key theme going back a few years. It's definitely shifted back into the balance of where things need to be when you're considering scheme funding. So balancing the sustainable growth of the employer is very important within the current AFS and the current environment, and that's also brought out by the easement guidance that the regulator published in March, and as I'll come on to later, has been updated in June. As I said, employer sustainability was a key theme going back a number of years, but the likes of BHS, Carillion, even Frank Field, the focus had shifted back to sort of the pace of funding and more into sort of to the scheme. But there's a definite focus again on employer sustainability, and I think that's everybody can see why because employer sustainability has become increasingly important in the current crisis. At the end of the day, having a sustainable employer who's able to recover from the crisis has to be the best thing for the scheme. So another key theme, affordability, that remains key, always been key. The pace of funding has been sort of at the centre of scheme funding for many years, but with a sort of eye to that the pace of affordability cannot undermine the sustainability of the employer and cannot undermine the potential recovery of the employer from the pandemic. It's probably just worth noting that a good chunk of the AFS 2020 has the tables that were first seen last year in AFS 2019. The tables, I think, are really, really useful. It sort of benchmarks and gives schemes and trustees and employers the ability to sort of see where they fit in within the population of DB pension schemes. So the tables basically segment the population and set out the key risks that the trustee and the employer face and focus on the actions that they need to do to mitigate them. It's worth noting that there's no change in those tables from last year. So, for example, the 7-year recovery plan, which is sort of suggested for employees with attending to strong covenant, is still appears to be relevant according to the tables. There are probably two issues with this, because we're not in last year, we're in a new normal, as I keep saying. So the first one is affordability, I think, will be diminished for an average employer. Certainly when I look across the portfolio of the schemes within Dalriada, that is absolutely a factor. And then secondly, the higher deficits, particularly for the March 20 valuations, just wondering how those higher deficits, so this perfect storm, if you like, of recovery plan lengths being an average of 7 years for attending to strong employer, in the light of higher deficits and constrained affordability, how actually that's going to play out. I'll come back to that in a little while. Can I have the next slide, please, Carolyn? So I think overall, within the guidance that's been published in March, from the regulator, within the and within this AFS, the regulator is sympathetic to all these issues. It acknowledges all these issues, and above all, sort of understands that it's going to be difficult to agree a recovery plan when affordability is hard to judge, because basically the employer hasn't got the visibility and therefore the trustees are unable to get that visibility in terms of covenant, affordability, funding, etc. So the advice that was in the AFS, which was relevant in April, and I think to a large extent probably is still relevant, although over time this will change, is number one, take your time. So defer and delayed valuation and recovery plan discussions until the situation becomes much clearer. So in Dalriada, for the tranche 15 valuation discussions, I think it's fair to say we've delayed probably almost all that I can think of, particularly in my portfolio, until later in the year, until we have more clarity on employer outlook. With lockdown easing, employers are going to be able to provide better information and the longer term forecast that they were unable to produce even just a few months ago. However, what we are finding is that there's still a big level of uncertainty, particularly with how quickly demand will return. I saw some statistics just in terms of researching this that said the Office of National Statistics surveyed a number of companies, which showed that over 50% of them, even going into the beginning of June, had turnover which was less than 20%, sort of more than 20% of where they were last year. So actually the turnover had dropped by more than 20%. And that was only 2 weeks ago. So there's still a huge level of uncertainty, and many employers are still forecasting on a number of bases. So I think take your time is still very relevant to the situation as we get into July. However, this doesn't mean an extension to the 15-month process for tranche 15 valuations, and the regulator's been very clear on that. So for example, for our schemes, we're still making sure that the scheme actuary is getting on with the sort of basic number crunching, but it's the actual discussions of the recovery plan and the covenant that have been paused. and guess when you get there, be more creative. So it's the guidance suggests that employers and trustees can adopt a more creative approach, so contributions that might step up over time, so in line with the forecast recovery of an employer. That was something that was, these sort of back-end loaded recovery plans was something that was potentially frowned upon a few years ago, but that appears to be the way that the way forward, given the fact that, you know, there will be a period of recovery. And I heard David Fair speak on this a few weeks ago, and basically sort of saying to trustees, don't have any regrets in terms of not including this sort of step up in recovery plan, you know, given that hopefully there will be you know, a strong recovery in later years. Also think about mechanisms to capture upside. So, for example, profit sharing agreements. So these could be based on either a sort of profit share, profit before tax, or a cash flow figure. So, for example, free cash flow. I guess some things to consider is that this is going to be contingent, so can't be written into the schedule of contributions, and therefore doesn't necessarily impact your recovery plan period. And also just think about, when you're using this, which metric to use. You want a metric that is clear and not open to misinterpretation. For example, free cash flow, for example, is not defined in your audited annual accounts. So those are the things, you need to be quite specific when you're defining those. And then finally, equitable treatment. Again, that's something that the regulator expects trustees to be really hot on. This was mentioned in the easement, making sure that you know, for example, on the obvious example is no covenant leakage by dividend, but it also can refer to sort of more sort of under the radar covenant leakage. So things like cash pooling, intercompany loans, management fees, transfer of business and assets at an undervalue. So all things that could potentially happen in a group situation where the trustee needs to be mindful that these events could happen, and just need to be watching out for them, because it effectively takes value away from your employer and out of the reach, therefore, of the scheme. So the next slide, please. So finally, well, nearly penultimate slide here. So what happens when lockdown relaxes, or as lockdown is relaxing? So on June the 16th, there was another announcement from the regulator, which made a number of changes to the COVID-19 suite of guidance that had been built in since March, and it's really coming back to, I guess, what I've said on the previous slide, that there's now greater insight, as we discussed, but that doesn't mean that corporates have recovered. They probably have more clarity, but what we're seeing is still a lot of uncertainty about how quickly businesses will recover. We mentioned on the previous slide sort of delaying valuations, but there is another side to it, that actually employers do want certainty. So whilst they're going to have this sort of difficulty in terms of when lockdown does ease and they are able to sort of, you know, increase trading, that they're going to have this level of losses that they need to be able to fund. They need to start paying back deferred creditors, for example, HMRC. They're potentially having employees coming back off furlough. So they perhaps do want certainty over their recovery plan, what their recovery plan payments will look like in the future, because they need to manage their key stakeholders, including the scheme and potentially external funders. So the take your time message, I think, is still relevant for the schemes in valuation year, because there could have been a material deterioration in the covenant, so that the scheme's funding arrangements may need updating. So are, for example, current deficit repair contributions appropriate? Should a valuation be called? So we're coming now to those sort of last points on the slide. I think what trustees really need to think about is, we've had potentially the easement requests. Is current recovery plan still applicable to your scheme? Has the impact of COVID been so deep to the extent that there has been a material deterioration in the employer covenant? I think there probably definitely has in the short term, but is that short term or is it medium term and going into the longer term? Those are all questions that the trustees need to be able to answer, but they can't answer that unless they've got the information. So it's slightly circular, and still therefore the take your time message is still very, very relevant. And then just onto the last slide, please, Caroline. So my closing messages are, I think expectations will have to change on the recovery plans. It's coming back to that table. Is 7 years for attending to strong covenants still likely to be the average, particularly when we all know that there's going to be these potentially very high deficits and constrained affordability? However, the core concepts that the regulator is putting out in both the June guidance and the annual funding statement, such that the principles of employer covenant, affordability and equitability, it's not changed. They can be shaped to the economic circumstances of the day. I think coming back to those tables, the tables are still relevant. It's perhaps what box you now fit in for the scheme might be different today than it was, say, a year ago. So integrated risk management still remains key. Covenant, investment risk and funding, they still need to be aligned. I think the regulators pointed out within a lot of the guidance that they've been giving over the past few months that the schemes that had IRM right, the ones who had the investment risk, covenant and the funding aligned, probably fared best over the last few months than the ones who didn't. And then the sort of final thought, leaving you with a question, is a funding consultation with its fast track or bespoke methodology. Is it going to apply as originally envisaged? Again, the thinking behind it was sound, but it's really, was it written in the old normal, and is it still as applicable to the new normal? I'll just leave you with that question. So thank you for that. I'm now going to hand over to Lucy from Pinsent Masons about her fishing expedition.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Sarah, for that. I actually haven't been on a fishing expedition lately, but perhaps one day I will. So I am an associate at Pinsent Masons. I work in the commercial litigation team with a focus on pensions, and a lot of work that we do focuses on pension scams and pension liberation. So I thought my topic for today would be fishing expeditions, because in my line of work, you see a lot of people out there trying to make money when something goes wrong. The term ambulance chaser is often, perhaps unfairly, used to describe lawyers who go out there looking for accidents or disasters. And in recent years, a whole industry of claims management companies, or CMCs, has developed with the intention of making money off large-scale misconduct, typically in the deep-pocketed financial services sector. Now, personal data and data subject access requests are the lifeblood of these operations and are used to help find and support potential claims. So if we go to slide 2, you will see a photo of Arnold Schwarzenegger encouraging consumers to make payment protection insurance claims through the Financial Conduct Authority's compensation regime. And while that regime was designed to enable individual customers to make claims themselves, many people did so through CMCs. And it is thought that the PPI compensation regime, which paid out over £53 billion in compensation, together with the introduction of GDPR which removed the cost of data subject access requests, created huge growth for the claims management company or CMC industry. On slide 3, if we just move to slide 3, I have set out the key features of a CMC. CMCs tend to focus on complaints where there is an existing compensation fund, e.g. the Financial Services Compensation Scheme. They will charge an upfront fee and or take a portion of any compensation paid if the claim is successful. And now that the deadline for PPI compensation has passed, well, through the FCA compensation regime anyway, CMCs are looking for new sources of revenue in other areas of financial services, such as pensions, investment advice, and closet tracker funds, to name a few. And we can see an example of this on the next slide. Sorry, just 1 moment. And what we have here is an advertisement I found from a claims management company asking if someone has been missold a SIP. So turning to the next slide, as mentioned at the beginning, personal data is the lifeblood of the CMC, and they will often use the Data Protection Act to demand client information, and they do so in an attempt to bolster or uncover a reason for putting in a claim, either against the party they have requested the information from or from a third party. You will often see CMCs contacting financial services providers asking for information about the products and services that their clients have received. So some situations where you might get a request from a CMC is if a transferring trustee might receive a DSAR on the back of a CMC looking at whether the transfer should have gone ahead or possibly just to aid claims against other parties. We've also seen CMCs contacting trustees in situations where an independent trustee has been appointed to a scam pension scheme, and they might be asking about investments or scheme transfer advice that a member has received previously. Under data protection law, where data is processed in the course of a professional or commercial activity, you have a duty to provide access to an individual's data on receipt of a valid request by or on behalf of that individual, the so-called right of access. There can be strict time limits in complying with a valid request and significant consequences for failure to comply, including fines by the ICO. However, you have a duty to protect this data and not just hand it out willy-nilly. So, in addition to being time-consuming, there can be issues in the way that these DSARs from CMCs have come about. So if we go to the next slide, which should be slide 6. In particular, one of the concerns that has been reported is of CMCs buying customer databases and cold calling potential clients or making DSARs without the individual's knowledge. And there is a little bit of information on this side about the cold calling ban that has been in place since September 2018. Possibly even more worrying though, is that the FCA has noted the recent practice of advisors leaving firms which have run up liabilities, often due to poor advice in the pension sector, only to re-emerge directly or via associates in claims management firms and then pursue compensation claims against advice that they themselves had given. It is therefore important for financial services providers to adopt a robust approach when dealing with CMCs, albeit one that is obviously compliant with your GDPR obligations. Now, I do not intend to go into the GDPR obligations aspect here, and I note that the next presenter is actually looking at GDPR a bit more. But instead, what I'm going to do is just outline some tips for taking a robust approach to CMC data subject access requests. Now, hopefully, not only will this weed out bogus requests, but it'll also hopefully disincentivize the CMC from making further spurious requests in the future. Turning to the next slide, slide 7. Since April 2019, CMCs serving customers in England, Wales and Scotland have been regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority. At the same time, the Financial Ombudsman Service became responsible for resolving customer disputes about CMCs. And law firms carrying out claims management services are regulated by the Solicitors Regulation Authority. So my tip number 1 is, if you're contacted by a CMC, you should always check that it is authorised by the FCA before responding. If the CMC you are dealing with is not registered, then it is not entitled to undertake regulated claims management activities. And on this slide, I have set out the link to where you can report unregulated CMCs to the FCA, and then hopefully the FCA will go off and investigate them. But actually, as far as the DSAR is concerned, an individual can, in principle, authorise anyone to make a request on their behalf. However, if a CMC is unregulated, I would contact the individual on whose behalf they have made a request and make them aware of my concerns, as it does rather call into question why the CMC would be making the DSAR in the first place, and likely it is because it is intending on carrying out some form of regulated activity. If the individual agrees, you may send the response directly to him or her rather than to the CMC. So if we go to the next slide, it brings us to tip 2. And as I mentioned earlier, there have been reports of CMCs obtaining their client base from dubious sources. It is therefore doubly important to make sure that the individual's details match your records. If you have any doubts about the identity of the individual on whose behalf the CMC is making the request, you can ask for more information. However, it is important that you only request information that is necessary to confirm who they are. And the key to this is proportionality. So it might be reasonable to seek proof of identity, such as photo ID and a utility bill, where the request is in relation to an unknown client. And you need to let the CMC know as soon as possible that you need more information to confirm the individual's identity. The period for responding to the request begins when you receive the additional information. Now, the next slide, which should be slide 9, should have tip 3 at the top of it. And that is to check that there's a valid letter of authority. And you should do that before you do anything else. And this letter of authority should say that the CMC acts on behalf of the individual making the request, that they have authority to correspond with you, and that they have authority to receive the response on the individual's behalf. It is the CMC's responsibility to provide evidence of its authority, and the time limits for responding may be extended if requests for further information are required. Where the details provided are incorrect or inadequate, you should respond setting out that you are unable to recognise the authority until you have appropriate evidence. And if there is insufficient evidence, then you're not actually required to respond to the DSAR. However, if you are able to identify and contact the individual concerned, you should respond to the individual directly to confirm whether they wish to make a DSAR. So just going to the next slide, which is sort of the conclusion and wrapping up these, tips for dealing with CMCs. So once identity and authority have been established, you should assess the request as if it was direct from the individual. Provided you are satisfied that the CMC has your appropriate authority, you should respond directly to that CMC. However, if you suspect that the individual doesn't actually understand what is being disclosed to them, for example, because the request is particularly broad or the information is sensitive, you may send the response to the individual directly rather than to the CMC. And of course, then it's up to the individual to choose whether to share that information with the CMC once he or she has had a chance to review it. So that was a very whistle-stop tour through fishing expeditions by CMCs, and hopefully my presentation matched up with the slides. And I was going to finish with a joke, but unfortunately pensions and GDPR are not fertile grounds for such things. So I've just inserted a photo here of Arnold popping up out of a shopping trolley. Yes, so hopefully you'll find these tips useful and some of this brief insight into the claims management industry interesting, if nothing else. And now I would like to introduce Sarah Miller from ARC Pensions.
Hi there. Thanks, Lucy. As Lucy said, my name's Sarah Miller. I'm from ARC Pensions Law, and I'm just going to talk to you just briefly today about some of the developments that have happened since that very hectic time 2 years ago when we were all scrambling around to put in place GDPR compliant processes. Just a few of the, obviously there have been lots of general developments since 2018, but I just wanted to focus on a couple that are particularly relevant for pensions. Just going to the background slide first. Obviously this is all sort of fairly straightforward stuff, but on the 25th of May, the General Data Protection Regulation came into force in 2018, and that sits alongside the Data Protection Act 2018, setting out the framework for the UK. That updated and replaced the Data Protection Act 1998. It's a lot more prescriptive in terms of obligations, as we all know. It was a big scramble, a lot of work to update scheme processes, and even from our own perspective, updating firm-wide processes to make sure that they're compliant. And obviously for trustees as data controllers of member personal data, and indeed special category data or sensitive data, there's a huge amount of issues that it generated for pensions law. The recent ICO guidance has shed some light on a couple of pensions issues. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the legal basis for processing sensitive data. And so if we could go to that slide, please. So the ICO has updated its guidance with regard to the use of the legal claims basis as a basis for processing special category data. to date, our clients and the majority of the industry, from what we know, have been relying on consent as a basis of processing. Article 9(2)(f) provides that where processing is necessary for the establishment, exercise or defence of legal claims, or whenever courts are acting in their judicial capacity, that is a basis for processing special category data. The ICO has now explained that the use of that condition isn't actually restricted to current ongoing legal proceedings, as was previously thought and implied in its guidance. So it can actually be relied upon where the processing is necessary in order to establish, exercise or defend legal rights in any way. Because the trustees hold special category data in order to establish if a person has a right to a benefit, they can therefore rely on the legal claims basis as a basis for processing special category data instead of consent, which is really, really good news. Avoids a lot of the practical difficulties of trying to rely on consent, for example, from contingent beneficiaries or those who have ill health conditions, where it really was not an ideal situation to have to rely on consent. Sort of an action point coming from this updated guidance is that trustees might want to look at their data protection policies, consider if those need to be updated, if they currently state that they're relying on consent, to change it so that they're relying on the legal claims basis and the reasons behind that change. So that's kind of the main action point to come out of that change to the guidance. Then moving on to data protection impact assessments, that slide please. So a lot of trustees haven't carried out a data protection impact assessment, or that's my understanding, on the basis that pension scheme processing wasn't generally thought to result in a high risk to the rights and freedoms of people, which is what needs to be the case for a DPIA to be needed. However, the ICO guidance has been updated on what is considered to be high risk. Now that includes invisible processing, that is processing data without providing the subject with a privacy notice, that relates to vulnerable persons, for example, elderly people, children, or those with certain disabilities. For example, that would capture processing contingent beneficiaries data under an expression of wish form without sending them a privacy notice, where those people are elderly or minors. The new guidance also includes decisions about an individual's access to benefit, which involves processing special category data. And for example, that would capture decisions about ill health, lump sums, or early retirement. So, it's looking more likely, therefore, that DPIAs might be something that are needed for the type of processing trustees are doing. However, the ICO has said it doesn't expect a new DPIA for existing processing where you have already considered relevant risks and safeguards, whether as part of a personal impact assessment or another formal or informal risk assessment process, unless the nature, scope, context or purposes of the processing have changed significantly since that previous assessment. So generally the ICO's guidance is talking of DPIAs being undertaken before the processing, and usually processing undertaken by trustees isn't new, or it won't have changed for many, many years. So trustees might be able to get comfortable that an informal risk assessment would have been carried out in 2018 as part of the general preparations for GDPR. So the sort of outcome for that, or action point, is that trustees might want to consider taking legal advice on whether, in light of the updated guidance, they feel a DPIA is in fact needed. or whether they can get comfortable on taking that legal advice as to whether they're happy that an informal risk assessment has been carried out that's sufficient, and if they do get comfortable with that, to document that in their GDPR policy. Moving on to the next slide, on trustee training, just a quick one really to flag that obviously, as we've sort of said, 2 years has passed since GDPR, and when you report a data protection breach to the ICO, you have to confirm in the form to the ICO whether anyone involved in the breach, whether those involved in the breach have had data protection training within the last 2 years. Obviously, trustees won't always be involved in a breach, especially, if, for example, if the issue had happened at administrator level, but they might be involved, and in which case, are they in a position to say that they have had data protection training within the last 2 years? And if not, they should think about whether or not to get some refresher training. That's the end of my slide. One final point I just wanted to touch on, because Lucy had sort of discussed data subject access requests and the period for responding to those requests. There has actually been some updated guidance from the ICO on that as well. The ICO has updated its guidance for anyone in receipt of a data subject access request to state that, quote, if you process a large amount of information about an individual, you may ask them to specify the information or processing activities their request relates to before responding to the request. However, this does not affect the timescale for responding. You must still respond to their request within 1 month. You may be able to extend the time limit by 2 months if the request is complex or the individual has made a number of requests. Therefore, the need for clarification doesn't cause that 1 month deadline to pause at all. So that's been some useful, a useful update to know that, because it was previously a little bit unclear whether there was any flex in the 1 month deadline if there was need for further clarification. And so that's it from me.
I think Kaz, back to me. Okay. First of all, thank you to Sarah, to Lucy, and to Sarah again for 3 excellent and really topical talks. At the moment, obviously the annual funding statement in the current environment. I think just so important, and probably something that all trustees should have to hand, because I rather suspect that the overarching messages in that and some of the related guidance are just going to become more and more imperative going forward as we see the loosening of restrictions and the government subsidy tap begins to be turned off. I think it's only then that we'll actually see a lot of sponsors looking to avail themselves of some of the provisions of that guidance, and particularly easements around things like deficit reduction contributions. And the data protection issues is something that it's very close to us, because we have been on the receiving end of a number of these DSAR requests and finding them very, very difficult, not least because usually the people that we're dealing with, which in our experience has been usually solicitors who have maybe had referrals from claim management companies, seem to be very, very reluctant to actually respond to correspondence, where we are trying to establish whether a valid request has been made and what exactly it is that we're being asked for. So I'm conscious of the fact that as I look at the screens, no questions have yet been posted, but I will give it a couple of minutes just in case people were busy listening intently before raising any issues. And what I'll do in the interim is maybe use my prerogative as chair is to ask a couple of questions, but probably first one for Lucy Chapman and then one for Sarah Miller. as both data protection related. So Lucy, to you, against that backdrop, we are getting these requests, and they're really wide-ranging requests. And then you try to engage the people who are making these requests, purporting to act on behalf of pension scheme members, but you get no reply for them other than to be chased for the information that was originally asked for. Is that something that you have some experience of, and any suggestions in terms of how you actually try to start a conversation with these people, to deal with it as a legitimate request, or to dismiss it as something which, if you responded to, potentially you could be breaching data protection legislation?
Yes, well, I suppose the tips I sort of outlined would be my sort of first line of response, really. So just, I mean, I assume in this situation you're dealing with solicitors who are properly authorised and CMCs who are properly regulated. So there's that kind of, I suppose, box checked, and then I would be checking that the details they have provided are, I'd be careful to make sure they do actually match up with the members' details, and then also be scrutinising that authority letter as well, to make sure that it gives proper authority for that request on behalf of the member. And then, assuming that has all been done and you're not getting any traction with these companies when you actually go back to them with reasonable requests for more specificity, I think I would perhaps raise that with the FCA, if that is something that one particular CMC, or perhaps the SRA, if it's a firm of solicitors who are doing this repeatedly and you're just getting nowhere with them. I mean, you obviously have to comply with your GDPR obligations, unfortunately, so you will have to, in the short term, comply with that time period. But if this is something that's happening again and again, I think I would be going to whoever regulates these particular solicitors or CMCs and raising it with them.
Yeah, thanks, Lucy. That's really useful. As I say, dealing with these people is sometimes, quite difficult, and even in some cases becomes a little bit hostile. So yeah, that I think that sort of two-pronged bit of guidance there is, one, check they are properly regulated, and two, remembering that if you are having problems with them, that they're not dealing with you professionally, then as regulated bodies, that there is recourse to the regulator.
That's right, yes.
But keeping with that sort of data protection compliance theme, Sarah Miller, if I could ask you, you sort of talked a little bit about data protection impact assessments. And I think our experience, which is I think was implied in your presentation there, is there wasn't a lot of DPIAs done when GDPR or DPA 2018 came into force. But one thing that's occurred to me recently is increased use of technology in pension schemes, and what we see here is a move from traditional administration models to maybe things like more self-service type pension scheme administration, and pension apps where members can check on their benefits in real time, 24/7, and so on. So that sort of transition, if you like, from the conventional pension scheme model to the 21st century pension scheme model, is that something that you think an impact assessment might have a role to play before that kind of change was made?
Yeah, I mean, I think not. I definitely feel like there's been a shift change in terms of. I think now I would be much more wary about sort of advising that a DPIA isn't needed without sort of quite a sort of hefty thought process into why it's not necessary, and that's definitely sort of shifted in the last couple of years, following the ICO guidance. I think it would be sort of definitely advisable for sort of a lengthy another lengthy kind of thought process on whether or not the trustees are still comfortable that it's not needed, and definitely some proper documented advice if it's decided not to have one anymore. Make sure that the policy reflects that advice, and then, because it's not risk free. I mean, the ICO even if trustees get comfortable on that advice that a DPI isn't needed and that sort of informal risk assessment is sufficient, there's still obviously that risk that the ICO might take a different view. And if that was the case, then you want to sort of be in a position where you've documented at least why you decided that one wasn't needed. So yeah, I think definitely in the current climate, good to have sort of that to hand.
Yeah, so I suppose essentially that it's not so much whether or not you do it, but just that your decision was an informed one and it's documented.
Exactly.
If ICO comes knocking.
Exactly.
Yeah, maybe just a final question on the data protection theme. Has your experience been, that for trustees of pension schemes, that they are actually setting down their policy in relation to things like data protection and cyber risk, as they do in other areas like statements of funding, statements of investment? Are you seeing a move to actually reflect, what the philosophy of the trustees are in terms of protecting members' data, which I think we've heard from all the talks, is the lifeblood of pension schemes and claim management companies.
Yeah, exactly that. I mean, certainly we've sort of all our clients that we advised have sort of formal data protection policies in place in writing, where we've kind of engaged with them on their GDPR, and I would definitely recommend that. And as you say, sort of treat it with that level of formality, as you would with many other aspects of sort of scheme documentation.
Indeed.
And it's really good to have something to refer to as well, in terms of just feeling comfortable that the trustees have considered all aspects.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's I think our experience as well. Just having it set down focuses the mind and reminds people of some of the very prescriptive requirements. For things like where there's a breach. Where sometimes reporting has to be almost immediate. But if that's not documented somewhere, somebody might think, oh yeah, I better get round to that. But the delay in itself can exacerbate, the problem and the sanction that you get. Just while we were having that discussion, so somebody has posted a question to you, Sarah, but Lucy may also have some views as well. And the question is, cybersecurity seems to be the new hot topic, and what has been the sort of lawyers' recent experience in relation to this, and how it interacts with GDPR? Because I think a lot of people sometimes think about them as one and the same, but there's overlap, but they're not the same.
Lucy, do you have any comments on that one?
Well, I was just thinking, I mean, if there was a cybersecurity breach, then the lawyers and claims management companies would be rubbing their hands and hoping to make some claims on the back of it. But in terms of practical advice, I might have to defer to Sarah on that one.
Nothing. I'm sort of not sorry. I'm having a bit of nothing's coming to mind at the moment, but perhaps I can take that one away.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, certainly if you have any views, but we can make sure that they're passed on. I suppose the only thing that occurred to me is that, you know, there's a lot of guidance out there for trustees now. I think the pensions regulator has a dedicated guide. Pension Research Accountings Group did a guide for trustees, and I believe there's something on the PASA website as well. So I mean, it does seem to be something that's really topical. Do you think it's fair to say that, you know, from a trustee perspective, where I think for many pension schemes, if not most, most of the day-to-day work is outsourced to service providers, that maybe the trustee's primary role is just to ask about the measures that these professional service providers have in place and to satisfy themselves on that count?
Yeah, and obviously, you know, trustees will have, you know, extensively negotiated their GDPR terms of contract back in 2018, in most cases, with their various providers to put in place those protections. And so obviously then it's just sort of a lot of it becomes about monitoring whether or not in practice those measures are being adhered to the extent possible.
Okay, thank you. Just checking again on the chat sheet, but it looks as though we're all getting off quite lightly in terms of questions today. I'm getting an extra half hour in our day as well, because we have scheduled for an 11:30 finish at the latest. So I think then that just leaves me to say thank you to Sarah Ballantyne, to Lucy Chapman, and to Sarah Miller for you know, wonderful, instructive and topical presentations. I found it very useful. I'm sure all our attendees did as well. And remember that we'll be having these future influencers webinars at least one a month, so there should be another one in July, and we hope to welcome you all back to that one. Thank you again, and have a good day.